how do you think Europe leverages its comparative advantages? Because there are certain industries that the EU is very well ahead. Do you think over-regulation is a problem? Do you think that there are any aspects to what the American sort of advances of the world, who are heavily critical of the EU, do have some very minor truths that the Europeans need to sort of cut back on?
Yeah, there are objectively important reasons why we're behind in digital tech, because there seem to be such powerful local economies of agglomeration in these sectors. He's just done a wonderful, Paul Krugman has just done a wonderful chart in his Substack, which shows that if you did the same analysis for America as we do when we compare America and Europe in terms of productivity growth, we will find that in the last 2 decades or so, 3 decades, productivity has risen far faster in California than the rest of the United States.
This is The Global Gambit.
How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to The Global Gambit, a podcast where we look at the intersection of geopolitics, international relations, and economic statecraft, with a particular emphasis this time around on geoeconomics, the economic angle. Because 6 months ago, I had a very interesting conversation with my guest today, Martin Wolf, the chief economics commentator at the Financial Times, who, shared his very blunt opinions about the state of Trump's tariff war and globalization. If you haven't seen those videos, I highly recommend them. But this video, I wanted to specifically look into the transatlantic relationship, what is going on between Europe and America particularly, but also in the context of Ukraine and other things like that. So, Martin, it's a pleasure to have you back with us. 6 months on, what do you think about the state of, shall we say, the main economic relationship of the world between North America and Europe, not obviously forgoing China and that?
Well, it's really very interesting because it seems to me the politics have changed to some degree in the opposite direction to the economics. And what I mean by that is that when we talked 6 months ago, it wasn't clear where the tariff war would end. But of course, we don't know for sure. But in the end, the US reached agreement with the EU and with the UK. It was a very favorable deal by Trumpian standards with the UK, but a pretty favorable deal with the EU. And the tariffs ended up, I think, at 15%, the headline tariff. Effective tariffs, I'm sure, are still lower. And the EU promised, again, this is from memory, to invest $600 billion in the US. I very strongly suspect that won't happen. Ursula von der Leyen never had the money. What the consequences of that will be, we don't know. But essentially, the economic relationship sort of was stabilized, not favorably to Europe, but it was stabilized. And there's less doubt about that than there was certainly after April the 2nd, Liberation Day, and certainly than 6 months ago, because that was before this agreement was reached. The politics, on the other hand, look more negative in 2 directions. And I wrote about this actually in my column this morning, and in ways that certainly weren't obvious to me, and I think anybody else, in the sense that the politics look much friendlier now to China than they seem to be then. Everything's almost lovey-dovey with China. The focus of the trade war on China, it's still very high tariffs, but they reached a deal. The US backed off because China turned out to have heavy weapons which it was prepared to use, with exports of critical minerals and rare earths. So they backed off from China, I think pretty obviously. And my colleague Ed Luce has again written an excellent column to discuss the fact that it turns out that China has really heavy weaponry, and Trump respects that. And the other aspect of the politics is that Trump is even more determined than he seemed to be then to reach an agreement on Ukraine with Russia on what are largely look like Russia's terms. Meanwhile, in the new national security strategy of the US, the only continent, the only significant power which is sort of really singled out as an enemy, an ideological enemy, is Europe, which is seen, particularly the EU, but also the UK, which is seen as civilizational enemies because, they're liberal democracies. In other words, they're not going along with the Trumpian war against immigrants, particularly immigrants from Muslim countries, brown people. There's no really other way of putting it. And As a result, they're basically concluded in this that in 2 decades from now, Europe won't be Europe anymore, and it will have lost its civilizational anchor as a white Christian civilization. That's sort of the language. And that, of course, goes along with their admiration for Putin, who plays the same game, the same rhetoric, not, of course, with China, but China's something else. And so I think the situation now is the politics look much more hostile, and the economics look rather more benign. What to make of that for the future at the moment? One thing I've learnt about following Trump is I really don't know.
I think that, the NSS or National Security Strategy kind of illustrated that America's treating Europe as almost like a culture war, right? Treating it as a
Yes,
national
they
security
look at America,
through a
they
culture
use
war.
the same language of Europe as they do of the Democrats. And that is a constant recurrent theme. It is, in some sense, they see Europe as the last redoubt of the sort of soft-headed, feeble-minded, liberal Democrats, believers in liberal democracy in its sort of previous incarnations that they are fighting at home. And this culture war has now been extended to Europe. Now, some people argue that this is really J.D. Vance talking through the NSS, because Trump obviously never read it because he doesn't read. And Trump's interests are rather different. His interest is doing deals. He doesn't have a real ideology. He's not really into this Christian nationalism, though he may play games with it. But J.D. Vance, from the speech he gave famously in Munich earlier in the year, really is. And he does read and he does think. And so we have essentially two policies, one of which is Trump's and one of which is MAGA, as articulated by this paper, and whose strongest voice in the administration is Vance. And that seems to me very plausible. And the question then, of course, is who's going to be on top? Well, in the long run, I would guess the MAGA voices, what I think of as pure MAGA voices, Vance and Al will be on the top because they're young and Trump is old, and he doesn't seem to me to be retaining his energy, and many people are commenting on his incoherence. Now, I can't really comment on that, but if you read his statements or listen to him, that sounds plausible. So the administration seems to have a couple of policies, but they coincide in a view that Europe is weak and despicable.
Yeah, there's a couple of things I'd say to that. Firstly, I think there's a lot of questions around what it's going to mean for MAGA post-Trump. We've seen with the dispute with Marjorie Taylor Greene that the camp is clearly divided or has growing factions, and a lot of people wondering what is post-Trump MAGA, and a lot of people look at J.D. Vance as that, although I think he'd take it in a slightly different direction. But with that in mind, like obviously something that I saw in the NSS, which was very notable, is this targeting of specific countries. If we're talking about the EU as a centralized unity, that's one of its biggest issues, which is it isn't. There's a lot of countries that differ in their perspectives, and I think they singled out 4 specific countries, with Italy being the most notable for Meloni's good relationship with Trump, about trying to sort of basically siphon off parts of the EU and break it up from within. I don't know if you saw that.
Well, yes, I think there's a broad point and a specific point. The broad point is very, very clear that Trump, and there they all coincide, Trump hates the EU.
Yeah.
An entity. And here I think there are 2 elements in its hatred of the EU. The first is that the EU together is quite powerful. Economically, it's quite powerful. It's a huge economy. It's actually the biggest trading entity in the world. And it's therefore much more difficult to bully. It's not impossible, as we've seen, but it resists because the force of the EU together is greater than the component parts. He can't pick on the pieces as effectively. He has to pick on the whole, and that's irritating. So he'd like the EU to be weaker, and the way Europe to be weaker, and the way for EU to be weaker is to fragment it. The other reason, which sort of coincides, but it's more ideological, is they believe very, very strongly, it's very clear in the NSS, that the world is the nation state, historically illiterate, as you'd expect, but never mind. is the nation state. The nation states of Europe are sort of primary entities, which is absurd for anyone who knows the history of Europe, and which have existed somehow forever, which is, of course, also absurd. But particularly some of the big ones, Italy and Germany, to mention,
Germany, perhaps.
and even the UK is quite new. And therefore, it will be natural for the EU to be broken up into its true component parts, nation states, and because they're the real political entities, and the emphasis is on patriotism, and the emphasis they give is on the support for patriotic parties, which are by definition, from their point of view, nationalist parties. So the Rassemblement National in France is their idea of a patriotic party, the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, and Maloney's grouping, again, right-wing nationalists are their natural bedfellows because they agree with them that the primary unit should be the nation state. And of course, so the two aims, fragmenting it because it would make it weaker, and fragmenting it because then we would be dealing with the real nations, the patriotic nations, coincide in this document, though they are really slightly different objectives.
Yeah, I think one of the things I'm quite insistent on at this point is I am very critical of Europe, but not because I don't want Europe to succeed. I think that this absurdity around Europe being sort of a non-entity. I was speaking to one individual in a debate another day, and they just said Europe is irrelevant. That's absurd because you're talking about 500 million people, a collective economy size that rivals, if not bigger, I think even supersedes that of America. It's impossible to reject the relevance that the European Union has as a collective, but as we're clearly emphasizing here, the ability to single out certain states is an issue. But as we've now seen with the sovereign frozen assets of Russia and them utilizing this Article 122 is quite a remarkable mechanism. What's your thoughts there? Can you see Europe doing more of that, really sticking its chest out, if you like, to push back in 26 and stand up for itself more?
This is, I think, the moment of truth. And again, very much the theme of my most recent column. If you're under attack, Europe, as it is now, is an attempt to marry the reality of Europe as an assemblage of states, which have their own histories, which to some significant degree can be viewed as national, though it's much more complicated. You start going through the histories of all the nations, the so-called nation states of Europe, but they have certain things that make them feel like nation states. Well, is the US a nation state? Hardly. The big question, look at it. And look at it now, look at its history. But leave that aside. The nation state side is real, but after the war, well, two world wars, which were, from this perspective, catastrophe, and from my perspective, was a civil war in some profound ways, because there was a civilizational commonality of Europe. In this, they're right, by the way. It's just I don't see it as racial. I see it as ideological values more than that, but that's complicated too. And it is rooted, of course, ultimately in Christianity. That's clearly true. But the point is, given that these devastating wars led to nothing but disaster and horror, the Europeans decided of their own, but with American support, crucial to remember that if they united, they could overcome the wars. That was what the coal and steel community of 49 was about, that they could become more prosperous, which they certainly did. They had immense economic progress in the post-war period, particularly the first 3 decades or so after the Second World War. They outperformed dramatically the Eastern Bloc, which is why the Cold War was won peacefully by the West, because the East Germans wanted to go to West Germany. I mean, things as simple as that, and be like that. So did the Hungarians, all the rest of them. Let's not forget it. So they built up a union which allowed them to do certain things together, economics and so forth, and certain things, most things they continue to do at the nation state level. That's the great achievement. And what we are now talking about is how this works in a world where the US is hostile, not friendly, and where Russia is resurgent. I mean, at least militarily, it seems threatening. And how does Europe then act collectively in these very different contexts when it can't simply rely on following US leadership? And that's, I think, the moment we've reached. And the Europeans have a question, can we act on our own effectively? And that means act cooperatively among nation states. It's never going to be a unitary state. That's completely obvious. Not even something like the United States of America. It'll be much looser confederation, but can they act collectively? And as you say, that what they've been deciding recently suggests maybe they can. They basically overridden the opposition of Hungary, which was, and other states which are sort of Putin's satellites. And the Germans particularly, and the French at least now, tragically Britain isn't there, have decided they have to stand up and become a major power again, leading Europe. And that's exactly what one hoped a united Germany would do. Now, will that last? That depends on the internal politics, which of course is the weak point the Americans identify. It depends on the US opposition. There's much to play for. But I think there are moments in the history of nations, collections and individuals, when you have to make a big decision. The old world is gone. The old security is gone. The old protection from your hegemon in this case is gone. So do you crumble into a little ball and let everybody ride over you? Or do you get together and say, we are in a powerful association of nations. We share common interests in the peace, stability, and freedom of our peoples and our countries, and we're going to defend it. And at the moment, I'm a little optimistic that the latter is what's going to happen. And that might also lead them to do a lot of the reforms they have to do, which we know about economically in the Draghi report and letter reports, because if they don't do now, they are really, really in trouble. And sometimes, as Monet famously said, Europe is born in crisis. Well, this is a big crisis.
It is. And I think, well, I've got a couple of things I'd say to that and into a question, which is simply that for me, I am cautiously optimistic. I want to believe the best in Europe. We have incredible human capital, human potential, but it's the complacency that has dogged the EU for what, the past 30, 35 years, my lifetime, basically. And I believe it was Joseph Borrell, the former sort of foreign secretary, if you like, of the EU, when he said to a meeting of European leaders about 3 years ago, he said, we need to be rid of our dependency on big energy from China, Russia, cheap markets from China, and security assurances from America, i.e. because Trump looks at the world in a way that sort of, 110 years ago, the 1800s of great power politics, not even competition, just politics, working together to dictate to the smaller states how everything works. And we see this because he seems to think that the EU is irrelevant. He can go to specific states on behalf to win them round to deal with his ultimate buddy, which is Russia, and then, of course, the Chinese. So my point of all of this is, what is the timeline, do you think, for the EU to actually sort of decouple, decentralize from these big three, so to speak, and become much more strategically autonomous?
Well, my view would be there are different timelines for different elements of this, and it can't be done tomorrow, as it were. I think in terms of doing the economic reforms that will make it more competitive, particularly in the newer technologies, digital technologies, and with a more competitive and dynamic financial sector to support this, that's probably quite a few years. Even if they make big decisions, it's difficult. And in some areas, you may just have to accept that we're not going to catch up. But this is, you can't transform the underlying dynamics of a huge economy, which it is, in 6 months. You can change policies, but institutions have to change. There's a lot of evidence from the IMF. The ECB has done similar work on the scale of the internal barriers to competition, particularly in services and in other similar areas like finance. And getting rid of those is going to be really hard work, and it will offend, as it were, a lot of very powerful vested interests, and it's not going to happen soon. So that's concerning. But at least maybe they will decide they really should start. And that's, of course, where the domestic politics of the member states really do matter very much. In military and defense, I would guess, looking at what Ukraine has managed, that Europe, as you said, it's a sophisticated economy with a very, actually in many ways, stronger manufacturing sector than the US, not, of course, than China. I mean, US manufacturing is quite small. And we have Germany is a really quite a powerhouse in manufacturing. So you can build tanks, shells, things like that fairly well. But
Seeing that done right now, aren't we?
you can increase basic conventional defense substantially, but there are obviously areas in which we are completely reliant on US arms production, and not completely, but heavily reliant. And replacing that, sophisticated missiles, for example, the Patriots and so forth, these things come from America, and building that up at the European level will surely take time. And then there's the question of the nuclear umbrella, which the US provides. I don't think it's very credible anymore. Is the force de frappe of France enough? Interesting question. We could argue it is. It could certainly do a lot of damage to Russia, but Russia has 5,000 warheads. So what do you do about that? I don't know. Naval power is very limited. But at the same time, what Ukraine has shown is that really quite low-tech stuff with a lot of imagination and innovation by a really weak economy, I mean, tiny economy, really, can just stop the Russian machine, which we didn't expect. What really emerged from the Ukraine war to me, as an ignoramus in this respect, is how ineffective the Russian army has been. I mean, it's basically been stopped and made almost no progress against this, on paper, very weak little state for years now. I mean, it's just extraordinary. So I think Europe can clearly do better than that. So I would guess that in a year or two, possibly less money, Europe is going to look pretty formidable militarily in a conventional war against Russia. And that will be very important. And the European wing of NATO will become increasingly, if not entirely, self-sufficient. And that's, I think, is feasible, possibly in not such a long time. So I'm modestly optimistic. The resources, as you stress, human resources and material resources in the competition with Russia, they're very, very strong. And we're not going to end up in a war with China. It's a very long way away. Either the Americans are effective in controlling the Indo-Pacific as they think they can be, or they're not effective, but we're not going to play a role in that.
No, I think the Sino-US dynamics is obviously, well, it's sort of where Trump puts his emphasis, but actually with what we're seeing now with this blockade imposed on Venezuelan US sanctioned naval vessels is insane. But I think what this makes me wonder is then one of the biggest advocates, and whether or not you like every single aspect about him, I respect his willingness to try to push the boat out, try to explore the future, which is Emmanuel Macron. He's proposed the idea of a tiered EU system, as well as obviously the new, everyone's favorite buzzword or term, strategic autonomy. But I think he has some quite novel ideas here. And so, given the context of Ukraine, given the fact that they're now losing their confidence in joining NATO, but therefore the EU, which has always been more acceptable by Moscow, do you think that there could be some kind of significant revamping of the EU in an economic sense, where you've got like a tiered system? The UK is re-exploring the customs union, for example, and how much could that benefit the EU's global influence?
Well, there are two different aspects, and my expertise on the institutional side is not that great. But it's clear there are lots of areas in which they can operate as a coalition of the willing. For instance, in the defense area, the umbrella could be NATO. And in that context, rather than the EU, and NATO, basically the European NATO is most of the member states. It might well include Canada. And within that, individual nations can decide what they're going to contribute, and they can decide what sort of force system they're going to need. If the US actually withdraws from NATO, which seems to be perfectly possible, in a way that would simplify it. But that's one possible shell. But you could perfectly imagine, since defense isn't really part of the EU, that the whole defense area is done outside it. Then in the economics, there are lots of areas where member states still have powers. Taxation, for example, regulation, lots of regulatory issues as decided the nations. They can pool their decision making in variable geometry, as it used to be called, and that can be done more or less institutionally among the member states, as long as it doesn't conflict directly with things that have to be decided at the EU levels. And then, of course, it's the latest treaties of the EU do allow a great deal of flexibility in operating in this way. And you could perfectly imagine structures of including the dominant Western members and Scandinavians, obvious Nordics, Britain too, participating in some ways. I think it could be perfectly effective. And if people like the Hungarians or the Slovaks try to veto this, obviously this is going to be ignored because ultimately the interests of great powers, as Trump constantly says, is dominant. And the great powers of Europe have pretty clear, at the moment, strategic interests in common, which is to secure Europe and their common defense and common prosperity. And while I think the British decision to go for Brexit was a disaster, to a significant degree in the areas we talked about, I think things can be built up again because necessity demands it.
Yes, absolutely. I think for me, the next 2 years are critical, partially because of the time and sensitivity of Ukraine, but also because of what happens with Trump. That he's going to be as aggressive as possible, given he might have his powers diluted in the midterms next year. But I guess this sort of leads me to this aspect of sort of how do you think Europe leverages its comparative advantages? Because there are certain industries that the EU is very well ahead. Do you think overregulation is a problem? You think that there are any aspects to what the Americans or the advances of the world who are heavily critical of the EU do have some very minor truth that the Europeans need to sort of cut back on?
Yeah, and this is going to be my last answer, but the it seems to me obvious, and what the Letta and Draghi reports said was right. There are objectively important reasons why we're behind in digital tech, because seem to be such powerful local economies of agglomeration in these sectors. Paul Krugman has just done a wonderful chart in his Substack, which shows that if you did the same analysis for America as we do when we compare America and Europe in terms of productivity growth, we will find that in the last 2 decades or so, 3 decades, productivity has risen far faster in California than the rest of the United States. And that's just because that's where the tech industry is located. And does that benefit all of Americans or even all of Californians? Of course it doesn't, because the income being generated is so concentrated. So it's going to be very difficult to replicate this without a complete integration of economies, which is going to be very difficult to achieve, creating the sort of market America is for California. That's very difficult. But if you look at the financial sector, you look at the labor markets, look at local regulations for workers and the way they prevent people getting the right to open up a business or practice in other countries, the obstacles are huge. So the completion of the single market, I think, in these labor market standards and certification, in finance and so forth, could make an enormous difference to exploit the potential scale of the markets. Another thing that I think is very clear is that the rigidity of labor markets, the difficulty of getting rid of workers when you just have to downside, is very discouraging for new entrepreneurs, and it lowers the rate of creation of new businesses. Very powerful work that I read a year ago on this by some Italian economists. So I do think this agenda could make an appreciable difference to the underlying rate of growth and productivity in Europe. But it also has to be accepted. Demography is an issue. If you want to sustain the growth of the labor force, it's very difficult to avoid immigration. The politics of immigration have become poisonous. So if Europe is to grow significantly, economies to grow significantly, since it's quite rich, with a shrinking labor force, that's going to be a real problem. And the politics there are big constraints, even bigger issue than in the US, because the demography in many countries is far worse. So I think there are things they can do. Will that make Europe really dynamic? Very big question. And the big Asian economies are likely to continue to grow faster. And that's just a reality because they've got so much catching up still to do. So, yes, we can make changes. Will it be utterly transformative? I think not.
I would just say, Martin, very quickly that migration has the potential, but Europe is targeting the wrong kind of migration. They're trying to clamp down on irregular, but they seem to be hitting regular migrants. So maybe that's something we could talk about with you next time.
Of course,
That's it
we
from me.
have to talk about that in another. I think a sensible migration policy will be less politically controversial. and relatively workable, though there are linguistic problems.
Of course.
Ultimately, the world is not full of genius technologists who speak German fluently.
No.
And the English-speaking countries obviously have a serious advantage. It's one of the big advantages Britain has. It's not exploiting it very well, in my view.
So that was part one of my dynamic discussion with the Financial Times' Martin Wolf. And reflecting on Martin's final comments is that immigration is a bedrock of any successful economy. People have always moved throughout history. And if you look at the current rate of migration versus, say, 10, 15, 50 years ago, the actual proportion of people moving around the world, which is sort of 3 to 3.5%, has remained very consistent despite the absolute explosion in population, meaning that the same amount of people proportionate to the overall size of the population globally has remained consistent. And naturally, migration is a core component of the EU's future, the considerations of what policies it chooses and how it chooses to navigate the growing challenges posed by Trump's America, China, Russia, the great power politics that we seem to be returning to. Now, the EU does sit in a difficult position, given the historical implications of, say, the Cold War, where the west of Europe was much more developing and prosperous than the east, and the immigration that subsequently occurred from Eastern European nations. We've seen a significant depopulation and therefore undermining of economic stability and the ability for those countries to grow. But on the same hand, we've also seen an imbalance in the north and the south of Europe, with Scandinavian countries, Germany, Britain, Netherlands versus, say, Italy, Spain, and others. So these kinds of considerations, the economic imbalances, geographically speaking, are going to be critical. And we can see that the European Union is beginning to take perhaps a little bit of a blunt instrument response towards migration, whilst wanting to review the European Convention on Human Rights and to discuss the revisions over asylum seekers, refugees. This is coming potentially at an expense of regular and beneficial economic migrants, those of a high-skilled value that will ensure that the EU can continue to compete and be successful. So it's these sorts of considerations, the relevancy of social economics with demography, that we have to take more and more into consideration, especially when we then get into the details of Ukraine. But with that in mind, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then do like it. Do consider subscribing and let me know in the comments below what you guys think. Look forward to part 2 with Martin Wolf. I'll see you all next time. Take care.